All right, hello everyone. My name is James Stewart. I'm going to be speaking today about the OSX command line. William Easton couldn't be here today, so I won't have a co-presenter. I used to work here at Penn State. I started doing big fix automation to automate all of our Windows and Mac systems for the group that I was in. And then I joined the central group at Penn State. Then I switched to UC Berkeley doing the same thing with big fix automation. And now I currently work with IBM using on the BigFix product itself. And so a lot of my job is entailed trying to get things to work on the command line for both Windows and Mac and Linux. So I spend a lot of time on the command line. So when we're talking about the command line, it kind of goes by many different names. Sometimes we refer to it as the console, command line interface, the terminal, or terminal.app on the Mac. Sometimes it's referred to as the shell, which usually refers to bash, which is the default shell. Some systems actually have more than one shell available, but bash is typically the default. If it is not, it makes me very sad. But these are all kind of the same thing. There are some subtle differences between them, but they could all be effectively the same for what for our purposes today. So OSX is Unix under the hood. It started out as Unix a long time ago, and it's kind of progressed from there, and eventually becoming what we can consider OSX today. But it really has its root in Unix. And all the stuff that we're going to talk about today is actually the same on Unix or Linux or Mac. It's all the same for the basics are the same. So when you write something using just those basic building blocks, it could potentially work on any of those operating systems. Not just OSX, which is pretty cool. The only one that is not really the same is Windows. Windows has its own command line interface with different commands, different ways of doing things. There are some overlap. There are some that are kind of like equivalent between the two, but generally they're not the same. So why use the command line? There are some operations that are just not exposed in the GUI. You can't get to it any other way except for using the command line, and you just do not have any other option. The command line options are also repeatable, easier to batch up and do the same commands on multiple machines. Takes less time than going through the GUI on each one individually. And almost all automation that you will do starts with a command line in some way. And almost regardless of what tool you're using or what you're doing to do the automation, if you're really going to do automation, there's generally some sort of commands that you are running in a batch process. And also on the Mac, there's something called single user mode. So if your Mac has a problem, you can boot into single user mode and it doesn't load up anything at all except for the command line. That's really all you have access to at that point. And so it's kind of a safety net that the Mac has. I don't know if you've ever experienced single user mode, but if you do, you will be stuck with the command line. So really what we're talking about today is the terminal.app. It emulates a terminal, and in this case, the terminal that we're sort of referring to is this very old school kind of mainframe terminal, which was a text-only interface. It used to be the only interface that these older systems had. Now it's something that we use for automation or for playing around, but it's not the be-all and end-all. So today, something like this is what we're going to be used in terminal.app. It's basically a text-based interface for OSX. So the generic syntax for doing commands on the command line, the very first word is going to be the command itself. It's going to be the name of the command. Then there can be multiple options specified for that command. They usually start with a dash. Sometimes there's 2 dashes and an option. And then whatever comes after that is generally called a parameter. So those are multiple inputs given to that command. Options and parameters are typically optional. Some commands do not require any of these at all. Some of them only require it to do something different with that command. So the same command can give you different output depending on the options that you specify. So one of the first commands I want to talk about is the man or command, which gives you the manual page or man page for a command. It's basically like a command to teach you how to use other commands. It's especially important when you are using a special option of a command that you haven't used as often. I'm frequently referring to them. So it gives you information. So I will show an example of that here. So if I type in man, it gives me the man page for man. So it explains how to use the man command. So it gives me the various options that are available, how you would actually invoke them, a description. It shows you, you see this little colon down on the bottom corner. If I press the return key, it allows me to scroll through, sort of scroll through the text. So there's actually more that's available than will fit in the window all at once. And just by pressing return, I get to see more and more. And then I can press Q to quit and leave this scrolling text. So this is extremely useful to look up other commands. You can also do this, and this says search all the manual pages available for this dot, but the dot actually says any, it's representing any character in this thing. So this will actually give us a list of all the man pages available on the system that man knows about. And so I can get this giant list. And so if you're wondering like, what is that command for the thing I don't remember? Well, look here, and you'll see a giant list that's almost too long to be helpful. Very long list. And again, press Q to leave that.
Do you want questions at the end or when they're related?
You can ask questions now. You can get the catch. I'd say for this, it's probably very useful to ask some questions as we go.
So one of the things I've discovered with the man pages is if you type in man for a built-in function, you're supposed to already know what it is because all it tells you, at least in my Mac, is that it's a built-in function. So take something real trivial, like if you type man cat or man ls or man, any of those kinds of things, I don't at least get a man page that has.
Yeah, you do.
Did you really?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So
What's wrong with mine?
So that probably means that the configuration file for your man is broken on your system, or is not specifying the right thing. So yeah. Busted. Yep.
Yeah, see, I get VSG. Oh, okay. Yeah.
So another command I want to talk about is pwd, or print working directory. So when you're in the terminal, it doesn't really give you the context for where you are, like kind of quite the same way that Finder does. And so when I type in print pwd, it actually gives me the location that I'm currently in the file system, which is very useful. It's very helpful to know where you are because any commands that you run on your system from the terminal are going to happen using this directory as the base, the current working directory. And so if you're in a different current working directory than you expect, and you run a command and the files that command are using are not present in that directory, then that command may fail. So it's important to know where you are. So another thing I want to mention is the command line history. So as you type in commands here, you can recall the previous commands by pressing the up arrow. And so I can actually bring up these different commands and run them by pressing the up arrow. And then as I'm going through this history, I can also press the down arrow to go backwards and forwards throughout the history. And this history on the Mac actually runs longer than your current session, but in other operating systems, it's typically from when you launched the terminal or the command line prompt. But Windows or OS X actually does some trickery to make it last even longer than that by saving it, which is pretty cool. So very useful to restore the previous commands. So ls is a command to list the contents of the current directory that you're in. You just type ls and hit enter. It'll give you a list of files. When you're on the command line, you don't have you don't see Finder and all the files and folders that are available, and so ls is kind of how you take a look at that. And then you can do more advanced things with ls as well. So if I type ls here in my home folder, going to get a list of all the stuff in here. And then I can also do ls-l, which is an option that we were referring to. And this shows me more information. It shows me permissions, owner, group, modification time, and then the file. So that's an example of an option that you can specify that allows the command to do something, or causes the command to do something different. So the other one I want to talk about is the open command. This is the equivalent on the Mac of sort of double-clicking on whatever that thing is. It basically tells the operating system, I want you to open this item with whatever the default viewer or thing is for that item. So if it's an executable or an application, it's going to open that application. If it's a text file, it's going to open it in your default text editor. If it is a URL, it's going to open it in the default browser. And if it's a folder, then it's going to open that folder in Finder. And open dot actually tells the command line to open the current folder, that working directory that we are in. So let me close that. So if I do print working directory, this is my current directory that I'm in. And then if I type in open dot, tells the system open the folder that I'm currently in, which it just did, which is pretty clever. It's also extremely useful if you are moving around on the command line into various different places in the OS, and then all of a sudden you want to open that location in the Finder to kind of take a look with the Finder and go from there. You can just type in open dot, and there you are. So it's extremely useful. So mkdir, this is the make directory command. This will create a new directory in the current directory. So for this example, if I do make dir demotxt. So now, down here, it's going to have this folder that I just told it to create. I can go inside that folder here, and I can also, so then now I'll have that folder in the Finder available. So the next command I want to talk about is change directory. You're going to have to change directories that you're working with in the command line. For instance, this new folder that I just created. So you can type in cd and then the name of the folder, and it will switch you into that folder. So if I type ls, I see the list of folders. I see the folder that I just created here. I can type in cd. And so now over here it's changed to say demopstu. And if I type in print pwd, it's going to show me the full path, this new location that I've created. So the Mac has a command called touch. And what this does is it updates a file's access and modification timestamps if the file already exists. If the file does not already exist, it actually creates the file that you tell it to touch. So in this case, I'm really more interested in the creating a file aspect of this. So I'm in this new folder that I created, and I can type touch demo.txt, and it's going to create that file down here. So now I have this empty file that I just created on the command line using the touch command. So cp is the copy command on the Mac. You type cp, the source file name, and the destination file name, and it's going to make a copy of that file. So if I edit this, putting some content in this file, saving it, hopefully. So now I have a second copy of that file. And so now this new file, instead of being empty as before, it actually has the content from the first file in it. So I could have typed touch demo2.txt and it would just create that file, but it would be empty. Instead, I made a copy of the original file, which is not quite the same operation. So the rm or remove command is used to delete things, to delete files. There's the equivalent on Windows called the del command. So I can come in here and type rm demo2.txt, and that file is going to disappear in Finder. If I check in the terminal, it's gone now. And then I can do the same thing with demo.txt. I can look in the Finder, and it doesn't give me a result. Now it's gone. So spaces. Spaces are important. If you have a file name that contains a space, you have to escape that space. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. So for instance, if I type touch demo file.txt, it's going to create a file called demo and a file called file.txt. It's going to create two files. But if I wanted it to create a file called demo space file.txt, I would have to do this. So I'm using this slash to escape the space. So now I have this file called demo space file.txt. Now, what if I want to remove the file demo space file.txt and I forget to put that little slash in there? I really want to delete just that one file with the space in the name. But if I do this, it's going to delete the other two files. Because what this has told RM to do is to remove the file demo and remove the file file.txt. But it did not tell it to remove the file demo space file.txt. So this will cause you lots of headaches and weird problems, and you won't necessarily know why. Because a command, you'll be issuing various commands, and none of them will have spaces in them, and they will all work just fine. And then you try to do the exact same thing with something somewhere as a space, either in the directory or the file name, and then all of a sudden something won't work anymore, and you won't necessarily know why. Or worse yet, you'll delete things that you did not intend to delete, like I just did now. So I can do the same thing before, like this. Remove demo with a slash space file.txt. It should also be possible to do something like this. So there I put it in quotes, and that basically told it, use this entire string between the quotes without that. So also if I do this, it's actually going to create a file with that slash in it, which may be what I intended, but maybe that's not. So I've actually escaped it with quotes, but then I've also put that slash in there. I've kind of done both. So that's a little trick. Also, if you're trying to create a file with a slash in it and slash escapes a space, that slash isn't going to be there. So I just tried to create a file with a slash in it instead of escaping a space. That slash doesn't show up in the file name. But if I put two slashes in there, now it will. So now all of a sudden I have a file with a slash in the name. So this is another problem if you're going to create a file and then add some stuff to the file, delete the file, move the files around. You may actually be messing with files you didn't intend to, or not creating the files in the way that you meant if you're not careful about these slashes and the way that they are interpreted by the terminal. Anyone have any questions about this? Pass that.
So with these commands, we're making directories, removing directories, and everything of what we're doing right now is all local on the one computer. Can you execute these commands to computers via network?
Yes. So one way to do that is called SSH. It's like secure shell, I guess is what that stands for. It allows you to remote into another system and then run commands as if you were on the command line there. So that's one way to do it. Also, there's ARD, which is Apple Remote Desktop, which is something you can pay Apple for. I think it's like $70, 80. So, okay, so it's $80, and you can hook up a bunch of different machines in there, and you can actually have a set of commands and send it to all of them all at once. I personally use BigFix to do my automation, and so in there I can create what is called an action, and that action runs a command on all the systems that I run that action on, and it effectively runs on the command line.
So SSH would run it on one system remotely, but if you have 50 computers where you're needing to change the configuration file for a specific security software to report to a server,
Yeah.
Programmatically, how would you do that with running that?
So you can
It
ARD would be one way to do it. Another way would be there's other programs that can basically use SSH, and what it would do is SSH into one computer, send those commands, SSH into the next computer, send those commands, and just keep doing that. But you actually have to have an SSH like credential set up on all of those machines that are going to be used to connect to that machine, and you have to be able to reach that machine over the network directly. Right. So if there's something in between you and that machine, then that does not work. So something like BigFix or Casper or other things, they install an agent on the device, and then you issue commands through a remote interface, and that agent checks in and then runs that command. So that's kind of the way to get around firewall issues, network issues, things like that. Like SSH is very useful, but especially for managing servers that you know how to get to, but for managing clients that are at home or somewhere else, you really have to have some sort of agent to do that. MDM is another way to manage devices remotely, but that's generally not using the command line of those devices. That's using something else. So really the only command line way to do things reliably, in my opinion, is with some sort of agent. Okay, absolute versus relative paths. This is another sticking point that can often get you into trouble. If the default folder that you start off in is called your home folder, which is generally /user/ whatever your username is /, and that's where we started in these demos, is in that home folder. That was the location, and so it can be abbreviated as the tilde character, which you can type by typing shift, and then it's the key that's to the left of the 1. And again, that's called a tilde. And with these way these paths work, these following three, these desktop /pwd1.txt, and then the tilde /desktop/pw1.txt, and /user/ whatever your actual username is /desktop/ pw1.txt. Those are all actually the same location. All of these are going to be exactly the same if you are in your home folder at the time. Now, if you're not in your home folder at the time, then it's only the last two that will be the same, assuming that you use your username in that case. With the tilde /desktop, if you had a command where you wanted to like create something on every user's desktop, or the current user's desktop, you could potentially use that as the location and then send that command, and it would create something on that current user's desktop, I guess if it's running as that current user. And that would be specifying the user's desktop without knowing that username and without hard coding that username in the command. Now in this bottom example, it's called an absolute path. It has the full path, so it actually has to know the username that you're targeting at the time. So it's going to go into whatever you put in that very bottom path that starts with /. And so this is often a problem where you could have a previous command change the working directory, and then a subsequent command that depends on the directory being in the correct spot and doesn't change or check, and then the subsequent commands run in the wrong folder, in the wrong context, and they don't affect the right files. So if I put some text in here, I can use the cat command, which we didn't talk about. Oh, so I output the text right here from the file. But then I can also type in cats users and actually output the same text from that file using the absolute path. So I can use either one to point to the same file. So pipes. Pipes are a more advanced command. You can take the output of one command and pipe it into another command using this character that we call pipe, and that is shift, and then I guess usually the key above the return key. So as an example, I can type ls, and it's going to give me both of these as output. But if I type ls pipe grep, well, that did not work. Bad example. Okay, so now I have 3 files. So if I put in file, what grep is going to do is it's going to take the output of the ls command and then look for any one that contains file. In this case, it's all 3. But then if I put in demo, it's only going to give me the 2 files that actually contain demo. So if you have a list of files that's extremely long or folders that are extremely long, you can essentially get the entire output of all of those files and then use the grep command, which searches those results and filters them, and then type in what you want to search by. And it will find it within that text. But it is case sensitive by default. So if I capitalize one of the characters, it's not going to return. So another common command is a move command. So I can move the file.txt that I created to file2.txt, and it's effectively going to rename that file. It's the equivalent of doing a copy operation and a remove operation in one. So instead of doing this, I could also do copy file2.txt to file.txt, and then remove file2.txt. And that would have been the same as doing the reverse move operation. So a copy and then remove is effectively the exact same result as doing move only. Now the cat command that I did show a little bit earlier, this displays the contents of the file on the command line. So if you are remoted into a system with SSH and you want to take a look at a log file and see what's going on inside that file, you would use the cat command. And so you could also make changes to a file and then check that file to make sure that they're there. Another common command is called echo. And what this does is just repeats the text back to the command line, which doesn't sound that exciting. So in this case, I did echo and test and an output test on the command line. But what I can do is I can say echo test and I can actually say redirect that output into a file. So now if I use the cat command on that file, it's going to have this extra text that I added from that output. Now, one thing you have to be careful with is if I just use this one here, this is going to take the output of the echo command and make it the entire contents of the demo file, completely overwriting it. So if I do this, now all the contents of that file are gone, and all that's left is that, you know, test output that I created. So sometimes you may actually want to overwrite the file with the output of another command, but generally that's not what you want to do. You want to append to that file if you want to add something to the end of the file. It really depends on what you're doing, but you have to be careful. You don't have to use just the echo command for this, so you can actually do ls, and then you can put that into a file. And if I do, it's going to have the output of the ls command in that file. So I can take the output of any command, redirect it to a file, and that's kind of how you can do logging whenever you're doing a bunch of commands, is you can tell it to redirect the output to an actual file, which is pretty useful. I can also use the quick look. I can see that those outputs. This ls-l that I did show earlier puts a bunch of other information. And so if I put that into the demo file, then I have all of this information in there, a bunch more information. Any questions? Yes.
I've been trying to run through like applications how I would apply this, and one that just kind of came into mind. Is there a command in which you can create an alias of a file and then put it in a completely different location? Or would that be multi-step, like duplicating the file, or is there a way to create aliases?
Yes, you can create aliases to a file. Generally, you create that alias in the location that you want it to be in. I believe it's different on different. Yeah. Okay. Different on different OSs, so I have to like learn how to do that. So ln demo file.txt, this.txt. So now I have this right here, this.txt that I created from this. Well, that's confusing. So it has the same contents, but if I add to it and then save it and then check it here, oh, that is weird.
Maybe the other demo file to the right of it.
That's possible. Nope. Huh. Oh wait, Wi-Fi. Well, what should happen is that they both should be changed because they're an alias to one another. If you change one, it should change both. So you have to be careful with that.
Just as a continuation, the reason I was asking is we had instances in the past where we wanted users to have an alias to a specific folder that was nestled like further down into directories, and we wanted an alias of that on the desktop. And we had to just send out instructions to our users how to create an alias and put it there. Or if we could do it through SSH and command line, I just didn't know if it was possible to create an alias of a folder, move it to the location you intend it to be in, all within command line.
So there's different kinds of these things. There's like symlinks, hard links, and like I think aliases are like an OSX thing, I believe. And so there should be a command to do exactly what you're saying. Something that we aren't, I wasn't really planning on covering here is you can also use AppleScript on the command line to automate things in the GUI and other things like that. So you could actually provide an AppleScript and just say like run this, and then it will do it for them. Or you could actually deploy that to the current user. So there are some cases where you want to do something in the GUI, and that is one option for it. You can also do things that are not quite in the GUI with AppleScript that are a little bit more advanced. So that is an option. I would have to look up how to do what you're talking about with the alias. But
Yeah, I don't even like that term. I always call them shortcuts. Just
sure.
OS 10 calls them alias. So it's just,
Yeah, but there's different levels. Like symlinks and hard links are file system level things that do something similar to an alias. And then in Windows, you have shortcuts, which are an actual file that points to that other location. It tells the operating system to treat it as that same location. And I'm honestly not sure of how to do that with OS X. That's not a symlink or hard link. But I'm sure you could look that up and do that. Generally, how I solve these problems is I look it up and I find the command and then I test it and send it around.
I apologize for asking a similar question again. Can you try a man CD? See whether or not you actually get a... There you go.
Oh, with built-in commands.
Yeah, I gave you a bad example before. The chmod is a good one, and so are a number of other ones. But some of those in that list do have man pages, but not all of them.
Okay. So some of these that are basic, they always go to this built-ins one. Yeah, so I believe this is because it's a BSD specific thing. These are like the built-in basic commands to BSD. But I think Linux may not do the same. Like they may have their own man page for each command. I'm not really sure. And one of the resources.
Also,
Oh.
Apple used to have on their developer website, and I think they've removed it. It was public and you could get it, but you could see each of, I don't know if these commands are included, but you could see a lot of the OS X specific command line commands, and it would show you this if you wanted to select what it looked like under say Tiger, and what it looked like under say Mountain Lion, and then some other OS Mavericks. You could do that, and it would give you the differences. But I think they've deprecated and hidden that and removed it.
Yeah, there used to be a nice Apple document. I think I still have a link to it at the end of my slides here. But I actually didn't check it to see if it's still alive. But this is another resource that I highly recommend for looking up command line information. So it has some that are like specific to Bash or Mac OS. There's kind of some overlap there. CMD is like the Windows shell. There's PowerShell, which is Windows new sort of thing, and other things. So it's a reference for a lot of commands. And so if you come in here, it has a nice listing of all these different commands and kind of the name of them. And then if you click on one of these commands, it actually takes you to the man page for that command, effectively. Some of these may actually have more information than just the man page, or it may have information that's custom if that doesn't have a man page. But this is basically like an online man page style resource, which is pretty nice. Whenever I need to look up how to do something, often I'll look at a particular command and then dig through its options on here rather than having to do it through the terminal. So it's a lot easier to research, especially if I'm trying to research the commands for a different operating system than the operating system I'm on at the current moment. So if I'm on a Windows machine and I want to figure out how to do a Mac command, or if I'm on a Mac and I want to figure out how to do a Windows command, this is a really great way to try to figure that out. How many in here work on multiple operating systems on a regular basis? Almost everybody. Cool. So yeah, I definitely recommend that. So something else I want to talk about is kind of like an overview of what's possible with more advanced command line scripting. Is a project that I worked on a couple years ago of installing the BigFix client, which I need to do on multiple different operating systems. I need to. This is basically the instructions on how to do this for Unix, Linux, and Mac, and the instructions are similar but different. So for each different operating system, you have to download the right version of the client. You have to figure out the correct install command for that operating system. You'll have to start the client, and that's going to be slightly different for each operating system. So like here, you have to create a directory if it does not exist. You have to run an install command, which again is different for each operating system. Start it, which is different. So there's all these instructions and all these pages. And so whenever I'm setting it up for a new operating system, I'd often have to come here and like make sure I have the steps right and make sure I don't screw them up. Usually this process is automated, but you know, sometimes I'm doing it by hand and I have to look up this information. And so it was very frustrating to have this like document that I had to refer to, had to go to the right spot, especially if I want to set up a bunch of machines quickly. And so what I actually did is I created a script that's somewhat advanced, and it actually uses bash that's actually common between all of these different operating systems, and it basically asks the system questions to try to figure out what system it's running on and figure out how to do the right thing through that. So you can actually check if a command exists by doing the output of this, which I just looked up, like, how do I figure out if a command exists? And I found online, you just do this. And so I was like, okay, cool. And so I created this function. I can call this function against any command, and based on that output, I can know if that command exists on that particular OS. There's a command here that will actually tell me if the system's 64-bit or 32-bit, and then based upon that, I can make some assumptions of which version of the client I have to install. I can actually check the distribution. So this is checking if I am running on a Debian system or an Ubuntu system. So it's actually able to tell me like what kind of Linux I'm on. Checking for RPM, which means I'm probably on a Red Hat based system. Handling SUSE. Checking to see that my script has root privileges when I actually do the installation. So if it doesn't have root privileges, it's not going to work. So there's a lot of these different things that you can figure out. Like if I need to know that my script is running as root, I can actually just look up how do I check that online, and you know, you'll get something like this, and then you'll know how to check that in your script. So this is checking to see if the installation directory exists, and if it does not exist, then create it. So here's the make directory command that I was talking about earlier. So instead of just blindly trying to make the directory, I can actually check to see if the directory exists first, and if it does not exist, then create it. Using curl and wget, you can actually download files on the command line, which is very useful if you're trying to install something on a remote system. You might SSH into it, download a file onto that system, and then run that file. And some systems have curl by default. OS X has curl by default, while other Linux distributions have wget by default, but not curl. And so I actually created a set of code that would say, like, if curl exists, then do this, else do that. So regardless of whether I'm on Mac or Linux, and regardless of what kind of Linux it does or has, I'm going to use curl the way curl is intended to do the download, or use wget the way it's intended to do the download. And so it will actually work on any system that has curl or wget, which is useful. Checking to see if the download failed or not. Then checking for different commands to affect the firewall on the system, so actually adding firewall things. So if IP tables exist, add it to that, which the Mac can have enabled. You can actually enable IP tables and use this. Firewall command is specific to Red Hat. And then actually do the installation depending on if the file that I downloaded is a .deb, PKG, or RPM, and actually do the installation. So I basically took these complicated instructions that were easy to screw up, hard to read, hard to figure out, and you know, I had to worry about every time I was on a new OS, and I turned it into a single script that actually does all the work for me and actually figures out what kind of system I'm on. Now, of course, this is a MacAdmins conference, so in the Mac case, you may have a script where you need to determine what subnet the computer is on, and then that might determine what printer to set up on that computer. So you might have one script that installs printers, but that you would deploy everywhere, but it will not deploy the same printers to all of your machines. It would check the subnet, and if it's one way, install one set of printers. If it's a different subnet, install a different set of printers. So really, you would just need to figure out the command to capture what the current subnet is, and then have an if statement to install the printers based on that command. So you can get as complicated as you want. You just really need to figure out what you're trying to solve. It's usually a Google search or two to figure out how to get that to work in the script. And if you already have a script to install your printers, then most of your work is already done for you. Does anyone have any questions about that?
I don't have a question, but do you want to show people how to clear the terminal in case they want to do it?
Sure. Well, that is a very good command as well. What am I doing? Oh, it's back here. There you are. So yeah, you have all this stuff here, and you can type in clear, and that will clear it away. So it kind of removes that listing of the history from your screen, but it's not going to clear this. So your history is still going to be there.
Plus you can still scroll up, right?
Yeah, it does. Allow you to keep scrolling up.
Also, once you change directories, say you moved up in the directory, there's also a way to move back if you needed to. Like right
Yes.
now you're in the demo PSU.
Right, so if I do cd ... that says move up to the previous directory regardless of what that directory is. I can also do, so right now I'm in this demo PSU folder. I could say cd and I could do users James-admin, and now I'm back to that same location. But I can also do, so now I'm in the desktop folder. I can also do cd tilde, and no matter where I am, I'm going to be back in my home folder. So,
Won't just CD do that?
yes, cd will do that as well. So now I'm like a couple folders deep. And instead of just doing cd ... and jump back up to library, I can type in just cd, and that brings me back to my home. Or I could do all of this. I could go back to that folder and then again do that cd tilde, and that brings me back to the home directory. Again, yeah, you're right. Those do about the same thing. I believe on Windows, typing just cd either doesn't do anything or it bumps up a folder. I don't think it goes back to the home folder.
CD minus get you back to the folder you had just previously.
When you're saying cd minus?
CD minus, I think, will jump you back to the other folder. CD space minus.
Mm-hmm. So it's jumping me back to the previous folder that I was in. Yeah, that's useful. Another thing that's useful is you can type in cd and you can actually drag a folder using the Finder and drop it on the terminal, and it will print out the path for you. And what's also nice is it will escape things for you properly. So if I put a space in here and then drag this over, it's actually going to have escaped that correctly for me. So I could actually, use this in a command. Of course, I didn't tell it to do anything. I wonder if that works. Nope. But you can then actually access that file that way. So if you're curious how to escape something, like you have strange characters in there that may need escaped and you're not sure how to do it correctly, by dropping it in there, the terminal will escape it for you.
How do you do that autocomplete thing? Where you're typing it and then it finishes for you.
Sure. So that's another option is if I type in demo, it's not going to autocomplete if I hit tab. Yeah, you hit tab. It's going to give me a list of things. Well, that's weird. But if I type in enough of it to be unique, it should autocomplete. Oh, what it's doing now. That is weird. There we go. Yeah, tab will autocomplete things for you if there are either files or folders in the current directory. It complains if you... So if I'm doing this, it's ambiguous because there's 3 different things in there, and it won't autocomplete, but if I hit it twice, it'll give me a list. And then if I put in an E after that, then that's specific enough that desktop could be the only thing left to autocomplete, and then it will work. But again, if I do DO, it won't autocomplete because it could be 2 different things. And so it won't allow me to do that. But then if I put in that, all of a sudden it's enough to autocomplete because there's only one thing it could be. And so if you hit tab twice, then it gives you that list, which is nice. Any other questions?
If you could talk a little bit about creating and running scripts with multiple command line commands, just the very basic.
Oh,
If I wanted to put a couple of chmod commands in something and run them as a unit,
sure.
what would I do then?
Can you repeat the question?
Good point. The question was, how do I do the basics of just bundling up multiple commands and run them all at once? So I'm going to get rid of all these files with rm star. Don't do this. It's a terrible idea. So now they're all deleted. Yeah. So echo. I'm not very inventive with my naming. So if I do cat demo.sh, it has these 2 lines in it. I'm going to mark it as executable. Like, what does chmod stand for? Change, modify? I don't know. It stands for something. But plus X says to mark the file as executable. So I've basically added 2 lines to a script. The lines are echo this, echo that. Marked it as executable. And then it actually ran those commands.
I've always chmoded A plus X. Why am I doing that?
I have no idea.
Okay, I don't know what the A is now.
That adds the executable privilege to all groups. So user, group, world.
Oh, okay. Is that what it is? Yeah, there's various options that you can use, and there are different things that kind of mean the same thing. Like you can use chmod 777, and that gives like all privileges to everybody, which is not necessarily a good idea. But you'll see people do that in scripts when they shouldn't be. Sometimes that's actually what you want to happen, but most of the time that's not a good idea. So yeah, that would be a real basic thing. No, you can also do sh-c demo.sh. Maybe. That. Oh, that's the command. There we go. That's what I meant to do. So when you're actually running stuff in the terminal, the rough equivalent of that is like this. Oh, that runs in another thing, so you don't see that. Never mind. Okay. Oh, that doesn't go to that command. All right, so this is actually a good example of how to troubleshoot these things. So there, I was actually able, what I was doing is telling sh, which is the shell, to run this command, and the command was touch demo2.txt, and it finally created it. Up here with the space, it actually didn't work, because what it did is it told sh to run the command touch, and then it just ignored this, or it tried to run that separately, and that didn't work. So I actually had to put it all in quotes to get that to work. So when you're running a command in the terminal, you already have the terminal, you already have the shell, and so you're issuing commands to that shell. But if you are outside of the terminal, if you're running it, I mean, I don't know what is a good example other than BigFix, because that's what BigFix does. It's effectively running outside of the shell. It's just like creating a process. But if you want to do it within the terminal, you actually have to invoke sh-c and then give it the command, and that says it to invoke sh, that's the process you want to create, and then you want to give it commands, and then it interprets those commands. So some of these things are actually like only known by the shell itself, and so if that's the case, then you have to have the shell interpreting what you're sending it, otherwise it's not going to work. You can do sh and then demo.sh, and this actually runs it directly, and you're invoking sh as the executable. So you actually don't have to do the chmod plus x if you're doing this, I believe. So if I do rm star, echo. So I can just do this, and it should work. Right, so it's inside this file, it's saying echo this 3, and if I just type in sh demo.txt, I'm saying use the shell to run what's inside this script, and I am actually not needing to mark it as executable. And this is actually useful because this will work in some areas where marking it as executable and running will not work. So on some operating systems, certain directories are marked as like don't execute anything under here no matter what, and it's kind of like a protection against viruses and stuff like that. And if you do this, where you invoke sh and then sh runs the scripts, this will work. But if you try to chmod it to be executable and then invoke it with the /demo.txt, it won't work. But it should be that if I do this and then run it, it does work. And so these things end in .sh when you name them that way, just for convenience, so that you know that it's an sh file, but it doesn't have to. You can send any text file and execute it if it's marked as executable, and if it contains valid bash, it'll try to run it that way. If it's an actual executable program, then it'll invoke it as the actual program, not as a bash script. But in this case, OSX is looking inside the file and seeing that it's text and deciding to run it in the shell itself, which is actually kind of dangerous. It's a kind of a strange thing that it would do that. But that's the way it works. But if you do this, you're being more specific. You're saying, I want you to use sh to do this. You're being much more precise about what you're doing. But if you're doing this here, you're actually leaving it up to the operating system to try to figure out what you meant by that and to do the right thing, which it hopefully will do, but maybe not.
I think it's called globbing, but could you say something about the feature of identifying with wildcards files and then processing them somehow? I mean, I always find that I don't end up with the right things that I thought I was ending up modifying and doing.
And what's an example?
Deer in the headlights expression right now. I can't think of one recently, but I know every time I've gone down that route, I've had trouble getting exactly what I wanted to.
So you kind of wanted to do something to every file in a directory or something like that?
Yeah, something like that, or in some cases find the users on a system by looking in directory services or something like that, and often find that that's problematic, or gets problematic particularly if they have funny characters in their file names and stuff like that.
Interesting. I'm not sure of a good example, but I think of Like there are different ways to say, okay, do something to every single one of these in a file or in a folder, or other ways to kind of like iterate over multiple objects using like a loop of some kind in Bash. I don't have any ready example off the top of my head, but sometimes when you're doing that, you're basically using the listing of files as an input, or the listing of something as input, and then doing something to that. And it's very likely that you have to escape them, that you have to put them in quotes, or that you have to do something else to escape those when you're then doing subsequent things. If there's any strange characters in there, it may work for 99% of the cases, but then there's this one case where someone has a space for some reason where there isn't normally one, or a strange character it's interpreted incorrectly by the shell. And so usually what that means is you have to just wrap those results in quotes somehow. Not sure if I know how to do that very easily. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how to wrap it in quotes, but there should be a way to do that. That is likely the problem that you were describing, but I'm not 100% sure.
I had some difficulty. Let's say you wanted to.
You want to talk into the box?
And then, so I want to put some text into a file, echo some text into a file, but put it on a network drive. And I was able to do it locally, but I wasn't able to do it to network drive. And I changed the directory to the network drive. Is there something else that I'm missing? Like, do you have to mount the drive, or?
So sometimes network drives are treated differently. It may be if you mount it, then it would work better. But one of the problems is if you're using sudo or some other things, it can actually like change your user context, and then you don't have write privileges to that location because it's no longer in the context that did have the right privileges to do it. So that sometimes happens where you're trying to do something to affect the network from like a ARD or something like that, and it doesn't have the same access sometimes that the user does. It really depends. So that can be a problem. Another problem can be that sometimes execution from network locations is not allowed. So if you're trying to execute a script from the network, that would not be allowed. But that doesn't sound like what you're trying to do. You're trying to echo text to the actual location.
Echo a variable to a file, the contents of a variable to a file. And I did it locally and it worked. And then when I tried to just save it to the network drive, it didn't work.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not 100% sure why that would be, but I mean, it may be easier to echo it to a local file and then move that local file to the network location or copy it.
Yep.
I can't really think of a reason why it wouldn't allow you to create the file there. It could be that just because it's when you're echoing like that and redirecting it to a file, it's being done by the shell itself, and the shell itself part of the problem is that it may not treat that network path quite the same as like on the file system. So it could be that it needs to be on the local file system for it to handle that correctly.
I'll try the move.
Yeah, the move might be better because
Yep.
that might be interpreted
Thanks.
better. But yeah, I can't say I've come across that myself, but I'm usually not dealing with network drives. You're just trying to like save results of something,
Exactly.
right, to kind of see what's going on, examine somewhere else.
Expired certificates.
That's interesting. I have not come across that. I have actually used like a Box API or a Dropbox API to actually send a file to a shared folder with an API token on the command line. So that's an option that would potentially work.
Thank you.
You can do stuff like that with curl. Any other questions? One in the back. You wanna... Yeah, you do. Otherwise, I get in trouble.
I'm not throwing it.
All right. Try to explain this the best way possible. I know this has like limitations, like it's not good at calculations. Like, what are some other limitations to this? Because sometimes I find myself going down a rabbit hole, and this just won't do.
Sure.
So maybe you can enlighten me a little bit.
So there are definitely cases where using something else like Ruby or Python might be a better choice than using Bash. if you want to do something really complicated with functions, especially, or really complicated things with multiple objects all at the same time, if you want to do one thing to them, that might be easier with bash than if you want to do multiple things to the same items in different stages. That's one case where programming is way better. I don't know that I can think of an great example. Bash is somewhat cross-platform, but not completely. So you can actually write a Python script that would work the same way on Windows, Mac, and Linux, where a Bash script would work the same on, potentially work the same on Mac and Linux, but not on Windows. So that's a reason why to write something in something else. I mean, do you have a more specific example of what you're referring to?
No, not really. Just like a general question. Yeah, 'cause not off the top of my head.
So I guess one example that I can think of is there's like a limited set of built-in commands for the Mac, and if you have certain software installed, it's going to add something to what's called your path, and that's going to make more commands available on that system. But then you may have another system that does not have that same software installed, and it's not going to have those commands. So you might write a script that works on one system but does not work on the other system because those commands are missing. Where if you are handling the dependencies within something like Ruby or Python, ideally that script is figuring out those dependencies for you, resolving them, and then allowing it to run on those other systems. Or there's better ways of handling that. I don't know. I can't really think of a really good example
So
of that.
pretty much no easy answer, right?
No, not that I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So you said you like bash of the popular shell scripts. Are there occasions where you might want to use some of those other shell scripts? I guess there's a T shell. There's a, I don't know
Sure.
what all of them are, but.
Yeah, so there are other shells. So now I'm in Z shell, and now I have no idea how to do anything. By default, the Mac launches sh as the shell, but it's actually just an alias to bash. So on the Mac, when you run sh, there actually used to be a shell just called sh, and that's all it was. Now almost everything uses bash instead. I think bash is like a superset of sh. And so then there's also T shell and Z shell and a bunch of others. They may or may not be available on your operating system. In this case, I'm in Z shell now. The reason to use bash over any other shell is because that's what most other people use. So if you try to look up on the internet, how the heck do I do this in bash or in the shell, you're going to get answers for bash. But there are other, like Z shell, I believe, has a lot more like object-oriented capabilities or something. It has, some of these shells have more features. But the problem is if you write something in these other shells, you're going to have to be very careful to execute it in that shell somewhere else, and that somewhere else may not have that shell. So it used to be a thing where users would actually set what shell they want on login, and they would log into a system, and then they would get that shell. So yeah, on Unix and Linux, the shell is not like always the same thing. It's not like in DOS where you always get the DOS shell and it always has the same set of commands and it always works the same way. On Unix and Linux, there's often many different shells to choose from, and so it's almost like having a completely different operating system, even though you don't. It's just the shell that you're interacting with. So yeah, now the reason not to use Z shell is because now I literally have no idea how to use my computer. I have no clue. I mean, I don't know what works. I don't know what doesn't. Some stuff probably works the same. Some doesn't. I have no idea. How do I get back to my beloved bash?
Restart.
I guess there I'm back. Okay, hooray. Exit.
On a
So
somewhat.
now I was actually layers deep there. So now I'm in Z shell. Now I'm in regular shell. So I'm actually not in the same shell I was before, and I don't have the same history anymore. So I'm shells and shells deep, and so now I do have the history.
Also, I've noticed that if you go searching online for help with a particular task, you may find some what are bash scripts, but apparently, I guess it's Linux, but apparently some of the implementations of some of these commands have additional flags or options
Yes.
that we do not have.
Yeah, so that is a problem. Is you may have like the CP command, and it may work on OS X and Linux, but it's very likely the BSD variant of it on the Mac In most cases, it's going to be the BSD version of it, where on Linux, it's going to be the GNU Linux version of that same command. And so in some cases, they have flags that allow it to do advanced things, and they are exactly the same. But in some rare cases, there's a flag or an option that you can use on the command that only works on BSD or only works on Linux. And so you may say, you know, Google, how do I do X in Bash? And you'll get a script like you're saying, and you'll run it, and it will not work on your system. And it's because it only works in Linux, or it only works in Ubuntu, or it only works in Debian, or it only works in Red Hat, or in this case, only works in OS X. Now, there's definitely operating-specific commands. Like, for instance, the profiles command is for, like, installing OS X profiles. That command does not exist on other operating systems, and if it does something completely different. So there are some things that are a little more obvious that they are different because they're operating system specific, so it doesn't make sense on any other operating system. But there are much more simple things like ls, sometimes there's different flags that are specific. And that ss64.com that I showed that has like kind of online man pages, it sometimes tells you, oh, here's this option, but it only works on X. It only works on this one thing. And so that's something to kind of know. It's kind of like a history lesson that you don't need, but you know, it started with Unix and BSD and Next Step and then Darwin and then OS X. It's all kind of built on all of those different layers. If something works from the Unix days, it probably works on OS X. Or if it works in the BSD stuff, it probably works in OS X. If it works in Darwin, it probably works in OS X. But something that works in like a brand new version of BSD because it was just added, that's not going to work in OS X because it's so new. So something that they add to the newest versions of BSD, that's not going to be in OS X. And something that they add brand new in OS X isn't necessarily going to work in BSD. But you kind of have this history of all of those things building up over time, and that's where all of these commands come from. And so you may have some commands that are only in Darwin and OS X, where you might have some commands that are only in BSD and Darwin and OS X. Yeah, that's a good point. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you.